So if I look at, the unit, which is business ethics. Now, in this unit, the main objective, why do we want to study this unit? What is happening now is that, as organizations have become quite global and their operations are spanning a lot of countries, they have lots of products and services. What is happening is that every organization is looking at operational efficiency, or they're looking at cheaper products wherein they can increase profitability. And to a certain extent, what is happening is because the operations are becoming, they become quite huge, and they involve not just scale, but also have a lot of complexity in it. The topic of ethics have come up, wherein it basically looks at the attitude with which the business actually approaches customers or, a particular issue or a problem. And what do the people working within the organizations actually perceive the way in which they want to, offer these products and services? How do they want to, say, for example, deal with the customer? Is there some sort of a principle, guideline, or process or procedure defined in the business to deal with certain problems which should not technically harm or create a harmful effect on another organization or another aspect of the business? So here the main reason of studying business ethics, which is the aim of the unit, is to understand and give you a bit of introduction into what is the role of business ethics and how they are used by businesses to plan and better manage the activities which they do in the business. So which are the activities they conduct, or which are basically how do they conduct themselves during or while doing the process of these activities to achieve their aims and goals or objectives. So one of the clear things when you look at like a company like Apple would be that they have a set of business ethics. They have basically a code, and that code basically dictates that every department, every individual working within the organization is expected to follow that code. So they take things quite seriously. So this has been developed and designed over the years within the organization, which kind of resonates and closely links to the ethos and the vision and the mission of the organization. So the vision and mission of the organization in the case of Apple could be that they want to bring out the products which create meaningful experiences for its consumers. Whether it's the iPhone, the iPad, iWatch, or whatever products you look at, they are looking at creating a meaningful connect in terms of how technology can influence and better help communicate, in terms of day-to-day operations. So it could be product specific, but in general, if you look at doing a quick search in terms of what is the goal and mission of Apple is, they want to bring across the best products which could be technology enablers, but they help deliver the best experience when you use their products. So the customers do not have to go through the learning curve, but the learning curve is shortened in such a way that the products become quite easy to use and they are quite intuitive. So that's all. That's in general, what the Apple ethos is. So when they do activities around this particular objective, they do it ethically, and that ethics are defined as the code of conduct. Now, there is a bit of discussion that we've done in Learning Outcome 1, which primarily talks, if I look at this, which primarily talks about, what are the various, first is what are business ethics? And then why do business need ethics? And then once we've understood this, we've gone into the definition of ethics to see that what is the basic circumference or, the basic idea around which the code of conduct for a business operates. What activities does it cover? What are the various things which could be brought into the the arena of when they say the conduct is around the ethics? Is things like corporate social responsibility can come in, adherence to law and legislation in a particular country can come in, adherence to employment laws to ensure they treat employees and resources fairly, and those can be brought into the remit of ethics. And then in the first learning outcome, we studied the types of business ethics. So there are two types. One is the moral objectivism, and the other is moral relativism. And then within that, we studied various types which have been, discussed over the years. And in conclusion, we looked at how they help in defining the, the moral principles or some sort of guidelines which the businesses are able to create while they go on conducting their business or doing certain activities, which are business activities to engage in selling their products and services to consumers. We also, in the first learning outcome, look at a basic comparison between the absolute and relative ethics. And then one which is a key part is that how is the, how some of the ethical issues are dealt by the management, and where is the remit of these ethical issues falling in with regards to human resources is what we looked at. So we looked at employment law, some of the key legislation in the UK, equal opportunities, and we looked at, workforce diversity. And those were covered in a couple of slides in order to explain why this is related to ethics. So when we talk about regulation, discrimination, for example, equality and diversity, how they can be, how these basic principles are then taken into account while creating the code of conduct for an organization. Now, in learning outcome 2, we basically looked at, getting into a bit more detail to understand what is a code of ethics. Some organizations have it as written, but when they have it as written, how is it defined? What is the common understanding of these ethics with every employee at different, departments and different, hierarchy of the organization? How these code of ethics influence the working of an organization? What can these code of ethics include? So some of the key things when we talk about code of ethics, talk about things like legal responsibilities of business, the management responsibilities towards staff and their workers, rules governing, individual behavior. We look at health and safety, equality and diversity, discrimination, treatment in terms of fair treatment amongst employees. And then in one of the aspects that we look at is what is the, output? What is the, for example, direct relation of code of ethics with the corporate compliance? So compliance side of things within the organization. And compliance side of things within the organization is when the organization is able to comply with the law and legislation which is laid down in a particular country or a geography, and they are able to, use those laws to be able to create the code of ethics within the organization. We also briefly looked at what could be the effect of, how these code of ethics are, impacting different types of organization. So the code of ethics for an organization working in the private sector might be different from the one in public sector, might be different from the voluntary, voluntary sector. So a charity might have a different code of ethics than a private limited company, than a public sector company. So we looked at some of these slides to understand the differences and how they interpret the code of practice, and why in some cases, it is important for businesses to understand what are how their competition actually observes these code of ethics. Code of ethics means the guidelines, the rules, the regulation. How do they, when it is set within the organization or written within the company, how does this affect the business activities of the business or the organization, and how these guidelines are affected by external environment, and then if the organizations face issues. For example, you have an incident within the office where you work and somebody gets injured. So what is the broad course of action? The broad course of action would be that you will fall back into something wherein there is a written process or a policy within the organization which says if the person has had this accident and that has caused some sort of a harm, first thing is you call 911, or you basically ring not 911, so obviously basically ring the A&E and or make somebody aware in the organization which is going to be looking after health and safety. And then when the person comes in or looks after health and safety, if it is beyond, which is the something which the internal representative can look at, then you will basically inform, the services to come in and, obviously look at it in terms of ambulance and things like that. So those things, and from there it goes on to maybe treatment, some sort of maybe, liability insurance, whatever it is, just as an example I've given. So here, the main thing would be that how everyone knows who was involved or around that when that incident happened, knows that this is the code of conduct or the set of policies, set of procedure which needs to be followed to do this. this is nothing but defined in the code of conduct, or maybe defined in the process within the organization, that if this is to happen, these are the various things which will get into swing, and that would mean that that is where the person or the organization will take action. So sometimes you record these in the incident logbook. Now, why I know this as a process is because most organizations have documented this as a process following the code of conduct or the guidelines given by the health and safety executive. So if an incident is to happen, you have to log it on the phone with the HSC if it causes bodily harm, or if it causes excessive harm which requires treatment. You might have to ring up at the HSC. You have to log it in the incident logbook, and if it is caused because of negligence, then some part of it can be compensated. If the expenses are higher, can be claimed from the liability insurance the company has. So all this is nothing but, what is it? This is a code of conduct. This is something like a policy or a procedure which has been defined within the organization. And if you have an issue or a problem, then in that case, everybody ends up following that procedure because that is what the understanding is. So from that point of view, in the learning outcome 2, we understood that how these code of conducts are taken and then implemented or kind of stitched into the company policies, so that if there is a requirement or if there is an incident which ends up happening, then these could be the plan of action which everybody understands and takes from a point of view of solving that problem. The other aspect that we looked at was that when you look at organizations, businesses, whether it's private, public, voluntary sector organizations, there are lots of stakeholders within the organization. And these stakeholders, when they look at the code of ethics, they interpret it differently. So for each stakeholder, the code of ethics has a different connotation or a meaning. And in some cases, when you look at the stakeholders and we divide them into different categories, what we will see is that the stakeholders will have different roles and responsibilities in observing these code of ethics. So people who are internal to the organization, like employee management, staff, workers, will look at implementing the code of ethics which are there, observing the code of ethics which are there. But when we look at stakeholders which could be external to the organization, which could be external immediate, because there could be customers, consumers, suppliers, partners, they will look at observing these code of ethics and bring it into their action in terms of workings, day-to-day workings, because they have to comply with some of these. And when we look at totally external, that would mean in the supply chain or in the ecosystem, you're not directly connected to the organization, but you have influence indirectly. And those could be things like when we say pressure groups, we're talking about the sector councils, the various groups which basically help in policy making, the government, and also the community. So they would have a different interpretation of the code of ethics. So they look at things from an outward perspective, like corporate social responsibility. They look at environmental compliance. They look at waste recycling. Their understanding of the observance of code of ethics would be that this organization is more green and favors the environment, is basically from an external perspective, because for them, whether you have an X policy or Y policy does not matter. What matters to them is your image, which is portrayed outside, and that is what the customers or these external stakeholders perceive, and they see and form an image saying that, okay, this is an organization which pays the dues, like when it look at companies like Facebook, Google, Amazon, which have been in the news that they do so much of business in the UK, but they're not paying the fair share of their taxes into the exchequer. So that external image is what the the external stakeholders are more aware of, or are more interested in. And how does the company portray a positive image, saying that, okay, we are doing everything by the book, we are following the laws, but we have these laws which we are making use of to save taxes. But that is where the influence of the portrayal of the ethics which the organization has internally is seen by external stakeholders. So that was learning outcome 2. In learning outcome 3, we are going to take it slightly further and then just maybe look at a couple of things, with regards to dwelling a bit more deeper into what do these ethics mean in terms of workplace relationships. That means how are these ethics going to have impact on the working of the company. In some cases, when the company starts to act as a moral agent, that means when you look at some of the some of the bits and pieces of news that we get, that Primark has set up factories in Far Eastern countries wherein they are exploiting cheap labor to be able to bring prices down, but the conditions in which the workers work is not safe enough. And we see this time and again in the news with different companies happening, with Asda, Tesco, Next, Primark, H&M. They are not seen to be kind of promoting the ethical practices which they follow in the UK when it comes to operations abroad. So we are going to be seeing the company's role of the companies and the management role in terms of understanding how these code of ethics need to be followed uniformly across wherever the operations is. And to a certain extent, what we'll do is we'll also relate it to the law and legislation in the UK, and what we're also going to do towards the end would be to understand what is the impact this this code of ethics could have on the workings of the business in general. And then in particular, what we're going to look at is the the development of these the rules and regulations which have been put in place over the years, and how do they impact the working of an employee within the organization. So how does the code of ethics, the legislation, empower the employee, and to a certain extent, how they use this legislation to ensure that the business in which they work or the company in which they work actually uses this and does not exploit the code of ethics to be able to do gainful activities to generate profit or gain customers. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So I've got a couple of slides which might be a bit of a repetition, but what I want to be able to do is bring them into the foray of learning outcome 3, because when we look at the role and the role of legislation and how the organization is accountable, we need to be able to kind of just quickly repeat to see what it means from the aspect of organization or to an organization. So here let's look at say ethics. Now why are ethics important? A couple of points which I would like to put forward is that most businesses today are concerned about the impact that they have on business environment. Now if you look at going back to the example of Apple, we've seen that over the years most companies within that telecom technology arena are looking at using less of arsenic, less of mercury, or the precious or the other metals which basically can cause large scale environmental damage. Now these metals which are used in the production of phones, iPads, and other some of the things can actually pollute the water table, and then obviously this would mean that this directly affects the environment. So in some cases, what we look at is that most businesses today, which are large-scale organizations present across the globe, selling services globally, are more concerned about their image in terms of how their activities affect the business environment. The second thing that we see is that when we look at ethics in general, because of the connected nature of the world today and the information which is available through various mediums, what we do get to see is that if something of this sort is highlighted, there is an increased amount of consumer awareness, in terms of if a company is flaunting the code of ethics or is committing, it seems to be committing harm to the business or the business environment, then these kind of things are perceived negatively or against the organization. One of the other things that we look at is also that sometimes you will see that when we talk about ethics, what does it include? So this definition or this, the meaning of ethics could be different for different stakeholders, as I mentioned. So when we look at business ethics, to an external stakeholder, it will be, say, what is the CSR or corporate social responsibility of the business? In some cases, you will see that ethics to, if I look at it from a financial point of view, it might be the accounting practices which the company has in order to pay the fair share of taxes. When I look at, say, for example, production and engineering, it could be the use of, things in terms of recycling, waste recycling, which means that the company is, or for example, low carbon emissions, which goes to show that the company is conscious or the business is conscious in terms of, the usability of resources that they are having when they produce their goods and services using the raw material which is derived from nature. So ethics could have, in general, lots of meaning, but when we look at ethics in general, the relevance of these ethics and the principles of these ethics to business is what we are more focused on, because we are studying it in this context. Now, these are some statistics which basically, have been collected over the years. One of them clearly says that companies do not operate in vacuum, which means that there's a bit of a give and take, between the company and the environment, or, when we look at suppliers and, the companies. So here they require a license to operate. So that is where the structure of the company, the legal entity status of the company comes in. The other thing which is important is that one of the surveys which has been done by Mori Research says that 74% of the public within 24 countries surveyed says that the company's social responsibility is an important factor when they decide on buying a product and service. So when you see some of the adverts, which we see on the TV, so when you see Procter & Gamble or Unilever advertising a lot of products, and they say that if you buy this product, the nappies, the Pamper nappies, which P&G actually advertise, they say if you buy a pack of these, 5 pence goes to, towards contributing, in efforts towards providing safe and clean drinking water in some countries in Africa. Now, this basically, when you're buying at the shop or when you're buying at these stores, if you recall this, then it gives you a positive feeling that, okay, if I'm buying this instead of, Huggies, then I'm making some sort of a commitment that I'm going to help the society or help this company, fulfilling a social cause. So CSR is considered by consumers when they shop, and, to a certain extent, this is something which has now become, let's put it this way, an important aspect wherein companies have started to focus on, because they are trying to use this as a marketing tool to a certain extent, but also as a tool to promote, to say that we, as a business, when we produce these products and services, we take care of the environment and we ensure that, we are returning, something to the society when these goods and services are actually sold. Now, some of the other things that we have to look at when we talk about business ethics, I think every organization has business ethics. So here we are looking at the aspect of morality, what is right from wrong, what is, the right thing to do. So businesses to a certain extent have to have this ingrained in their code of ethics or in their, employee guidance. When I say an employee manual, when I say, a brochure of a company or a history of the company in terms of the vision and mission, this is something which they have to keenly reflect on, to say that this is a part and parcel of the company's ethos. And knowing this and ensuring that all the employee, staff, workers act on this and, kind of show this on a daily basis, or, bring this into the workings on a day-to-day basis is important for businesses, because they want to portray a specific attitude or an image outwards to the organization or to its consumers. So when we look at business ethics, it's primarily understanding the right from wrong, and also to understand how the businesses are going to conduct itself in terms of, when we look at people internal to the organization, people external to the organization, or people connected to the business, or, suppliers, like suppliers, partners, or vendors who basically supply goods and services to the organization. So to a certain extent now, ethics are a part of, legal requirement, more or less, for a company. So when the company is formed, sometimes you see, if you want to register a new company in Companies House, you you choose a name, you register a company, but there is a memorandum of understanding which also gets generated. And within that MOU, what you also see is that that MOU also has certain context and certain clauses included in it, which basically defines the type of services the business is going to get into. So if you register a company, one of the key things they ask you to do is talk about the sector in which the company is going to be operating. So if you register a business and you say, I'm going to be a consultancy firm, or I'm going to be, say, for example, a training firm, then you choose a particular code, services code, and that services code basically, when you choose that, so for example, when you say, okay, I'm going to be a consultancy company, and maybe the code, is 84001, then that code in terms of consultancy has a couple of ethics which are defined, and they get incorporated into the MOU, which is then formed for the organization. So when you look at that, in general, companies code of ethics. So here, that will happen is that when you choose the code of ethics, it will become a part and parcel of the MOU, which is printed. So I'm just a general one, sorry. So every company will have their own code of ethics, but basically what they will do is they will include that into the vision and the mission of the organization, and to a certain extent how the companies will offer their professional services will also be covered. So every company will have a different code, but some part of it will have semblance to what is already defined and what is already available within that sector and has been set by the government or by the regulation. Now, one of the other things that we will look at is that how does ethics affect the business. We want to understand what is the role of ethics and how does it affect the business. Does it affect positively? Does it affect negatively? What kind of influence does it have? And in case if it is affecting the business, or it is creating an environment in which the business is not able to prosper, then what does the business do in order to kind of interpret those code of ethics to kind of solve these issues or problems? So as I mentioned, one of the key things that you can look at and everybody can relate to is that when we talk about business ethics, we talk about CSR, corporate social responsibility, and there's a concept of sustainability, environmental sustainability. So when we look at a lot of companies like IKEA, for example, they produce furniture, correct? So when they produce furniture, they also look at a lot of deforestation. That means they have to cut down trees to be able to bring that raw material, and to be able to produce furniture. So what the sustainability side of things do on the ethical side of responsibility for the business is that if they cut down tree, they look at planting 10 more trees in place of that, so that there is this resource which is renewable. So they in the future have this as a renewable resource, and number of trees are then planted for the number of trees that they are cutting down to look at as raw material for furniture. So in this case, what we do see that there are 2 or 3 concepts which are become quite important from a company standpoint of view, and these tend to be corporate social responsibility and environmental sustainability. That means how are your operations in line with the requirements of sustaining the environment and not harming the environment in which you're using these as or using the environment to extract the raw materials. Now, this bit which I brought in, which is the Modern Slavery Law Bill. Now, in October, obviously, in 2014, this was abolished, but there was a formal apology by David Cameron in the Parliament saying that this will happen and all. Now, the reason why some of these can be related to ethical practices is that a lot of companies today employ workforce abroad when they try and produce products, because some part of the manufacturing is outsourced and some part of this manufacturing is happening overseas. So when we look at a lot of these brands, now these brands or companies have become a part of the ethical trading initiative, and this means that they are looking at in general people who work within the company or provide services to the company in terms of labor workforce. They are going to be able to treat they are saying that we've signed a pledge that we will treat workers, whether in our country here, in our company, or through a partner or outsource, will treat them fairly. And that would, and they are looking at making sure that the wages and, some of the other things, which is in terms of working conditions, the benefits are going to be made available equally to people who are either employed for the business directly or indirectly through a supplier, vendor, or things like that. So they signed up to this ethical trading initiative, which meant that they will respect workers worldwide, and they will ensure that the same facilities which they provide to people within one geography or country when they operate would be in line with what they will provide to workers working in different geographies or countries, but helping to produce the goods and services which they sell under their brand. And here is where basically I've given an example of the Primark and H&M, for example. They have a lot of this manufacturing that they outsource to Far Eastern countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh. You look at Philippines, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, wherein they are able to get cheap labor to be able to do the same manufacturing if they have to do it in the UK, and that would mean that there will be higher retail shelf prices. So in this case, what these companies have done over the years is that they've signed a pledge now, wherein they ensure that even if they hire workers or outsource services in places like these, in order for their products and services to be produced, they are going to instruct obviously certain stringent laws and measures to be put in place so that the workers in these locations, when they work on their work on their products, work to produce, say for example, their products and services, are treated fairly and are given the basic amenities which which the company is expected to provide to its workers when they're working in the UK. So this bit, in terms of the ethical trading initiative, they also said that we are not going to be looking at employing children. And in a lot of countries, when these companies look at outsourcing work, they do not get into the details of who is employed at the end of the at the end of the day, and then whether the suppliers or partners who've been authorized to get work done are actually employing in order to get cheap labor. Are they employing children? Are they paying the proper wages? So all this is being now checked and audited when a setup is done or a plant or a factory is made, and there are people who are going in to basically ensure that this is complied with, because these companies have signed up with the ethical trading initiative. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Some of the key things that we looked at, slightly old, but they appear with different refreshed names. When we look at that, say for example, Foxconn, was recently in the news, wherein they said that some of the workers working in Apple factories, you would have seen that people have been found sleeping because they've been asked to work on a 14-hour shift or an 18-hour shift while producing iPhones, and they saw that the workers were actually sleeping on the lines. So this led to Apple to investigate, saying that this should not happen, and there should be proper shifts and proper checks being done to hire workers. It should not be that companies are employing workers at very cheap labor and not giving the basic minimum required in case of when they outsource operations abroad. So a couple of examples here, like Apple, there was obviously you see the mattress that's being advertised on the TV when you look at Benson beds and things like that. One of their factories were caught wherein they were paying migrant workers to basically assemble the goods which were coming from China into the UK before being sold on to their stores, that they are migrant workers working. There was a big incident in Bangladesh wherein the Primark factory, there was a fire and led to several people dying, and then Primark undertaking something called the Unit 14 initiative or Unit 4 initiative, which they've taken, which means that any factory, any work that they outsource to outside the UK, they will undertake a thorough audit before the supplier or the vendor is approved to do manufacturing of their goods. So some of these things also relate to child labor. There are lots of factories in India, for example, in developing countries wherein suppliers are able to kind of employ child workers to be able to get the job done when they're not paying them fairly, and these kind of things could happen. So these companies signed on to a pledge to ensure that these mistakes do not happen again, and this has now become a part of their business ethics. So if they are looking at outsourcing, they are going to be looking at doing robust audits, looking at inspecting the factories or the suppliers' premises, ensuring that the contracts drawn up between the workers and the owners are complying with the guidelines given by the company and the head office. And last but not the least, some of the services, when they are used to create these products and services like clothes or say any good or service that the company is looking at producing, they will look at paying fairly to the workers in terms of the daily wage pay, which is in line with the wage requirements of that particular country. So this is where the businesses side of things started to happen, that they've started to work within the organization. They've appointed somebody responsible enough to act as a moral agent to audit some of these things so that the compliance can happen. It's not just something which has been written in the book that this is the code of law or this is the code of ethics for the organization. But when that manual is picked up by the person to go and review, they see that there's no adherence to this, totally being flaunted, and nothing which has been mentioned is being actually done when the outsourced workers are actually working in factories. So it's important to understand that two sides of these things is one with regards to the corporate social responsibility, the other is sustainability, environment sustainability. Where the companies have started to act and take moral responsibility because they are utilizing natural resources, and what they want to be able to be seen in the market is that they are a company which is concerned about the environment. They are a company which is concerned about its workers, even though it's outsourcing work, and the conditions which the workers are in when they kind of produce these goods and services which are sold in the developed world. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Now, the other bit that we need to look at is we need to understand the role of, the stakeholders, and why, the role of stakeholders is important when we look at, ethics in a workplace. So there are different types of organizations I mentioned, and these are some of the repetitive slides from Learning Outcome 2, because what we want to do is we want to understand that different stakeholders will have different expectation of, and different meaning of the ethics. So here, sometimes when you look at different types of organizations which are set up, it could be private, public, and voluntary sector, they have a variety of needs. That means their main goals and objectives are different. So the private organization might be looking at focus on profits or, returning more, say more investment on capital. When you look at public sector organizations, they would be accounted for more on the types of services they deliver, the customer service levels or the service level agreements that they've signed to be able to offer services. But in the case of voluntary sector, they would be looking at how these services are actually helping the society. So you look at charities like Oxfam, for example, when they work in different countries, their main aim is to alleviate poverty. One of the clear aims of Oxfam as a poverty charity is that they want to eradicate poverty. When you look at Shelter in the UK, they want to look at providing sustainable housing to people who do not have access to housing, and their means of follow-up in terms of the main set of activities is to look at greater good of society. So depending on the type of organization, the structure, and the sector in which they operate, the regulation in terms of not the regulation, the ethics that the organization follows could be different. So here, what we want to be able to do is, in order to understand the requirements of the stakeholders, we need to understand first the types of organizations and what kind of situation, environment they work in, and how their requirements of or interpretation of ethics is different with regards to the sector in which they operate. So primary, secondary, tertiary, or primary, private, public, and we look at voluntary. And when we look at that, we basically look at how their priorities are different. So even if in the private sector their main priority is to make profit, they have to look at following certain norms and legislation. And these could be talking about the saving the environment, looking at less carbon emissions, which is again environmental sustainability, reusage, recycling, reusage of waste. If you look at one of the new legislation which the European Parliament has introduced, is that by 2022, all retail outlets have to have 70% of the energy being used in the stores to be renewable energy. So when you look at large outlets or retail parks like Next, look at Tesco's, ASDA, Sainsbury's, they will need to recycle 50% of the waste within the facility in which they sell, and they will need to produce 70% of their electricity through renewable resources, because there's a lot of wastage, and these large outlets, what they have said is, are major contributors to carbon emissions. So in order to reduce them, there is a lot of incentive which the legislation has introduced, which means that a lot of modernization happening for some of these stores. They're looking at installing solar panels, light-saving electricity, or LEDs in certain aisles, so that if there is no movement in the aisles, the electricity switches off. Those kind of things which are being introduced now. If you see some of the revamping of stores happening in Tesco's, as does in Sainsbury, and this is to look at hitting that major target or compliance which has been set now by regulation, to say that they need to be able to have this environmental compliance with regards to sustainability. Now, going to stakeholders. So we know that different organizations working in different sectors and different types in terms of legal entity will have different stakeholders. Now, these stakeholders will have different requirements. So when we look at different requirements here, what we want to be able to look at is, we know that private sector, if you are a shareholder in and have shares of Amazon, for example, or Apple or some of these companies, you're interested in understanding how the company returns more profit to you, how do you get more dividend or earnings per share every year, and you're not too concerned or first about what are the activities or what how the activities are being done. But now some of the side, when you look at say a shares issue comes out, the organization in the brochure, the leaflet, when they print out, they also print out information related to sustainability. They also print out information related to corporate social responsibility. So why do you think Apple harps on the fact that we do not use any metals which are going to be harmful to the environment, things like mercury, arsenic, these kind of things, because they want to be seen that we are a differentiator and our prices are slightly high, because it could be used in different ways. But one of the clear things which Apple highlights these facts is that they want to ensure that, and they say that we comply with legislation. That could be on the external stakeholder type. They could also look at saying that why we don't use these metals is because we do feel that this can harm the environment or our natural resources. So this is seen as this is seen as a function wherein they are not harming the environment, related to environmental sustainability. And last but not least, some of these metals are precious metals. So when they do recycling, recently when they've launched the new iPhone, they've introduced a program wherein you can recycle your old phone and get some discount. So what they have done by this gesture is saying that, okay, we'll give you some money for your old phone, but we'll also help recycle that phone, because when we recycle it, we dispose of it in a way wherein, it doesn't let the harmful chemicals go into the landfills. Would be that they will extract precious metals out of it, or things which are going to be taking years and years to degrade, or say for example basically degrade in the natural environment. They take those out, they process them to ensure that this is showing their social responsibility towards preserving the environment, or the basically the environment for future generations. So sometimes you will see that this will create conflicts as well within different types of stakeholders. So if Apple is to start spending a lot of money in terms of recycling and waste recycling and those kind of things, and this, if it is reflected in the report, normal shareholders which have a couple of hundred shares would not mind, but some of them who are looking at having, say, majority stakeholding, like the Berkshire group, which has 4% stakeholding. Icon, for example, the investor, ICANN, which has about 2% shareholding in Apple. They look at some of these things in minor detail, saying that how much of spend is actually being done on this. And they, to a certain extent, post that 2% of this has to go on CSR, or, a percent of the revenues have to be spent on ensuring that we are able to, meet the requirements of, say, carbon emissions or, legislation which has been set by the government. So you have seen yourself, and I think you will recall that Apple, in general, sticking to the example of Apple today, because I picked that up from beginning, is that Apple has also revamped its stores, in most locations. You've seen that?
No, but I've seen their headquarters, like pictures of their headquarters.
Correct. So that has been a quick discussion with, obviously, and because of a lot of curiosity, there are lots of YouTube videos on the Apple Dome, which has been constructed, which is the new headquarters for Apple in California. Now, what they've done in that is that if you see, they planted 80,000 trees. Obviously the campus, I don't recall, but I've seen the video myself. It's spread across a vast area. So what they've done is they've installed solar panels. It's costed a lot of money to Apple in terms of building, but what they've ensured is that they've integrated the aspect of reusability in terms of rainwater being collected, the light. It's 100% eco-friendly. That means all the electricity is generated through solar panel. They've created a climate around the the headquarters, wherein they planted so many trees to make it natural. And there was a lot of upheaval when this was being made, and the land was being reclaimed. They deforested a lot of trees. So they've kind of done all that back in a way to ensure that it portrays a very good image about Apple, that yes, they've spent a lot of money, they've created a big headquarter, which is now the headquarter of Apple. But in doing so, what they've done is they've integrated the environment, they've looked at the preservation of the environment, and also what they've tried to do is they've tried to basically ensure that the large carbon footprint is not there for this particular building or the infrastructure, because most of the energy, air conditioning, and all those things are basically generated through solar energy. But initially, when you look at from a different aspect, a lot of stakeholders said that spending $2 billion in terms of creating this campus, was a vision of Steve Jobs, but this could have been avoided by not building that campus and Apple taking up premises elsewhere, blah blah blah. But that was a bit of a conflict, because some investors wanted that Apple should probably pay higher dividends because it was using profits that it has to be able to construct and fund some of these activities. And that is where the conflict sometimes does happen, is that the dominant stakeholder group might have different aims and objectives, and they might want to push the organization into one side to say that, okay, this is more important, this is what needs to be done. And from that aspect, sometimes there are conflicts which can be created. And that is where the company needs to balance the expectations with regards to the ethical codes of practice that it follows in doing its duties, or in derelicting their responsibilities in terms of executing the responsibilities. So let's look at one or two brief slides with regards to understanding what I've said. How do these policies, code of conduct, actually create accountability for the organization? So now, the vision and mission of the organization which the owners create, say for example, they define certain types of things, and that kind of portrays an image of the organization. Now those main guiding principles at some stage are taken up by the HR department or the people working within the quality department to create certain guidelines. These guidelines are nothing but what is called the code of ethics. So if I understand that that if this goes wrong, this is to be done. But in order for that to happen, a detailed procedure needs to be written. And that is something which is done in the form of guidelines, policies, procedures, when the code of ethics is established. So if you hear, say for example, the owner or the managing director in the company saying that we need to answer the phone in 2 rings. Now what he's done is he set a guideline that we need to be vigilant, and we need to be ensuring that customer calls are ordered in 2 or 3 rings. Now this has to be translated into some sort of a code of ethics within the organization. What does that mean? That if you are working within a call center, or if you're working within an office and there's a phone which rings, then at some stage this needs to be defined in terms of how this process will work. And that process of working is defined in something called the code of ethics, which could be that, okay, first the phone rings at reception, assuming if nobody picks up. In the second ring, the phone starts ringing on some of the other, department or people within the department, so that somebody else can pick it up. If there's a call waiting, 2 rings happen, somebody else picks it up. So all these nitty-gritties and combinations are then picked up after a directive given by the managing director saying, okay, the call needs to be picked up in 4 rings or within 4 rings. Then this guideline is written, and that then becomes a code of ethics. So when a new employee joins, you get an employee handbook, and in that employee handbook, it gives you one of the basic details like how the phone handling has to be done. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So that is where the code of ethics gets defined. Now, if we look at legislation and accountability, as I mentioned before, that when you look at some part of the regulation which the government introduces, and if that has to be followed by the organization, then that has to be followed because it is a law. It is something which is a mandatory requirement. Now, if you set up a private limited company and do not register with Companies House, that entity is not recognized. So one of the key requirements of registering a company in England and Wales, or for example in Scotland, is that you need to be able to register the organization with Companies House, and details of that registration need to be provided. So those details of registration which need to be provided include things like the name of the director, the the percentage shareholding, and there has to be some memorandum of understanding or articles which are generally produced to ensure that these are the services and regulation and compliances which the organization will do, along with the registered address. So those things have to be looked at when we look at accountability from a legal perspective or legislation perspective. Now, when a business or a company has to comply with this legislation, what they have to do is they have to follow different laws which are laid down by different bodies. So in the case of, say, banking, one of the key things that you look at is that in the case of banking, the Banking Financial Conduct Authority would actually look at regulating, the workings of the institution. Correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the case of marketing, when you look at the ASA, the Advertising, ASA, Advertising Services Agency, basically looks at, regulating whether the ads are offensive, comply, or are, of a nature which is meant to be complying with the legislation laid out. So some of these bodies, when you look at, are set up in order to ensure that there is compliance from organizations. Correct? You look at Ofgem, you look at Ofcom, Ofvat for water. Now, why has the government created these is because they want to ensure that at some stage the companies operating and providing services within that particular arena have the, they follow the legal guidance. They follow the bare minimum legal guidance which is there to be able to operate in that environment. Correct?
Yes.
So sometimes what you have to see is that when we look at legislation, the government has created laws like the recent implementation of GDPR, the data protection law changing to the GDPR law, and that came into effect on the 25th of May. What that meant is that if the organization does not have a data protection officer and does not maintain their records properly, wherein they also introduced that a person or whose records are being held by a company can actually write into the company to find out what information they hold, how much information they hold, how they're going to use it, and in some cases can also, in this case can also request that information to be deleted and not stored, is now available under the GDPR law. So if they do not comply, if an organization does not comply with this data protection or GDPR law, then what tends to happen is that you can also be levied fines by the government. So when we look at that, it means that sometimes if you do not, comply with a particular legislation, then the government can actually, under the General Data Protection Regulation or GDPR, can enforce fines. And I think in the news a couple of days back, I can't remember the name of the company, but one of the companies has been asked to pay $500,000 fine because of the breach of data of consumers, which the company was holding. So unsolicited calls, there are new legislation which have been brought in, and this has been brought in to ensure that, customers are not harassed, their data is protected, and those kind of legislation which the companies have to comply with is done in order to create what is called the accountability when they operate within that arena or deal with that information. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So these slides basically focus on that. There is a bit of a YouTube video which I've included, which basically talks about how accountability is basically addressed by the organization. So let's look at briefly, and there are a couple others that I've included in terms of links. So when we look at legislation and accountability, these could be the ones which you have to refer to when we talk about employment law, when we talk about basic rights in terms of equality and diversity, and we talk about health and safety. Is that okay?
Yeah.
And then some of the corporate governance law, which basically we have covered in Learning Outcome 1, I've summarized it here, that when you look at a lot of things which are now happening within companies, is there's a lot of IP related lawsuits happening. So if you're using somebody else's property or something which has been created, there are rules against which the companies have to adhere to and say that okay, this is somebody else's intellectual property, they have to pay royalty or licensing fee to be able to use that. So this is all included in the corporate governance and accountability law, and some of these have to be referred to just to understand that how they inflict on having the organization having code of ethics. So if I look at employment and industrial law or corporate governance, then corporate governance would have some bearing into the ethics of the organization. Social responsibility would have some, and things which are to do with finances in general, consumer protection will also be there. So just going into looking at that, and that is where what we need to be able to do is understand the importance of how you will look at evaluating the implication of ethics from a stakeholder point of view and from an accountability point of view. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So today that's what we've been able to cover, is that when we look at how legislation creates accountability, which are the different laws, and when we look at stakeholders and their responsibilities in terms of how they influence their activities influences the company, then following the ethics and creating a code of code of conduct or code of ethics to be able to function within the employees to function within the organization. So a bit of a mundane topic, to be honest, but the idea here is that we need to understand three key aspects of what we have covered today. One is we want to understand what is the relevance of ethics to the business. Sometimes it is left to the organization to comply, and those could be in the case of corporate social responsibility, environmental sustainability. The second is we need to be able to understand how does this legislation which is created by the government to ensure that businesses have some ethics for operability is to the root of legislation, or and that legislation essentially creates accountability. And the third thing that we need to understand is what is the effect and interpretation of these ethics for different stakeholders of the organization. So different stakeholders means you have employers, partners, suppliers, government, community, society, whatever, and then different types of organizations in different sectors. So they have different understanding of what their ethics requirement is, because they produce different goods and services, or they cater to different type of consumers in the society. So their expectation and interpretation of the ethics that they include from an accountability point of view and from a social responsibility point of view is different of how they bring it into their code of conduct, employee handbook, maybe policies and procedures. Okay. Now, in order to basically understand this, what I'm going to do is this copy of the presentation will be available, but apart from that, what I'm going to include is a bit of a handout which will give you some reading on the type of laws which essentially are required to look at corporate governance in particular. So there are three aspects here that we will get a handout on. One is corporate social responsibility, the other is corporate governance, and the third is environmental sustainability. Because if you study these three areas, you will understand that where all, in terms of the remits, the ethics are impacting the working of an organization, and at what level to a certain extent different types of stakeholders within that organization.
Okay.
And then my suggestion to you would be to also revise Learning Outcome 1 and 2 so that it will help you get an overall picture of starting with ethics, types of ethics, the theories around ethics, how does businesses perceive ethics, role of stakeholders in creating the code of ethics within the organization, and how does the business then look at managing, adhering, and complying with these ethics under the 3 different routes, which is corporate governance, environmental sustainability, and corporate social responsibility. Okay?
Okay.
Any questions on this, Philip?
Not on this one, no. I've got a question on before what we spoke about earlier with the referencing.
Yes.
And going on to Google. Is there any other sources that I could use?
Is there any, sorry?
Any other sources that I can use?
Yes, you can. There are loads of resources. So, say for example, if I go on to Moodle, there are a couple of things that you can do. One is, see, when you say resources, there are loads of resources. But if I have to just briefly explain, give me 1 second. So I'll end this session here in order to continue our discussion.